Assalamu alaikum. Hello and welcome to a webinar series hosted by the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. At SIGA, we have a series of talks that we regularly invite experts in the field of international relations to speak about pertinent topics. The webinar series has hosted a number of theoreticians and thinkers on topics as vast as political history, international theory, and Middle Eastern politics. Today, we have Professor Dr. Sami Al-Arian, who is the director of our institute, and he will be speaking on "Is the American Empire Unraveling a Sociopolitical Analysis?" Dr. Sami Al-Arian is well qualified to comment on the state of American empire. With his long engagement with the study of American power and its influence globally, he has directed a number of national level coalitions against what are deemed imperial practices both home and abroad. In 2001, Newsweek deemed him the Civil Rights Activist of the Year, and he was in charge of creating a national platform against secret evidence. Later on, in 2003 to 2014, there was a public campaign which led to his arrest and eventual deportation. Today, Dr. Sami Al-Arian is at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, where he writes continuously about American power and political and Middle Eastern politics. And he's our director. We're glad to have him. He has published pieces in a numerous of syndicated magazines and media platforms. He also has a number of books on international relations. Dr. Sami Al-Arian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Uveys, and welcome everybody to today's talk and discussion. I hope to have more discussion than talk. The title of this presentation, of this session, is the American Empire Unraveling, a Sociopolitical Analysis. What I will try to do is to discuss, because there are many questions now that are being posed in light of what's happening. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I need to talk to my mama. These were the last words of George Floyd, which resonated with many. You know, I can't breathe is not just physically he can't breathe, which led certainly tragically to his death, but there are a lot of people, not just around, particularly in the United States, but also around the world, who find life being so difficult, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the structures that we live under today, where they can't literally breathe. And when we talk about the American empire, we're talking about many facets of it. I have addressed these issues before in other talks and other presentations, which I will not repeat here. You know, we discussed the 6 strategic imperatives, what sustains the American empire. What I will attempt to do today is to discuss the different issues related to the sustenance, but also to the unraveling of the American empire. An empire is where you have a central state that has power and certainly authority over a vast amount of land and resources, and is able to dictate what it wants on not only on its population, but to a large degree on the world. And that's what we have today in terms of the American empire. If the American empire is unraveling, then we're talking about different issues that have to be addressed. It's not simply that we have riots and looting and people angry everywhere, because we certainly had that before. You know, what's happening today in the US has a legacy. There is an original sin that started with this. America certainly has reached much advancement in its ability to mobilize its resources and build its power and make the U.S. economy as the #1 of the world, U.S. military as the number of the world, and so on and so forth. But it was built also in a legacy of what some may call the original sin, which was built on slavery and also on extermination of indigenous people and all these issues which were related to the establishment of the United States, even though the Constitution had these lofty ideals that people always tried to look up to. Yet these problems have not been dealt with. So I will, for empires to unravel, we have to deal with military issues, we have to deal with social and cultural issues, we have to look into economic issues, we have to look as well into environmental issues, and of course political issues. And I will try to address these briefly so that we can engage in the discussion that is needed here. On the military side, I'm not going to get into the military side. As I said before, I have dealt with this before. I talked about the American empire, its impact of building its military, what it means to the world, what it means to the United States, the fact that you have 800 military bases around the world, the fact that in many instances, the US empire looks at every problem as a nail that needs a hammer so that it can get rid of. I'm not going to get into that. Just one point, that the law of the United States and certainly the spirit of the Constitution prevents the military from actually taking an active role in controlling the population, at least a direct role into doing this. That's called the Posse Comitatus Act of the 19th century. Yet there was another act which actually in contradiction with this, which is called the Insurrection Act, that actually allows the military under certain circumstances, and that's what Trump was trying to do the past couple of days, in which it can go down and try to control. And of course, that comes out of the legacy of the Civil War in the 1860s. But let me just concentrate on the immediate situation at hand. The legacy of racism in the United States, the legacy of having a large number of people who were imported from one continent into another in trying to rebuild this vast continent that was basically put together over a century is a painful legacy, and it has reached not just historically into the population, but also in the psyche of the generations to come. We're dealing with a struggle that has existed now for over 400 years. In the aftermath of World War II, this is almost a century after, 80 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, 80 years after supposedly they were freed, we had this civil rights movement that came out of this discrimination, out of racism, racist laws that were put together in many states across the nation, in which African Americans, or blacks at the time they were called, were put down so that they will never be able to contest any share of their country's future, any share of wealth or power. And that struggle existed pretty much over a quarter of a century. So in the 1960s, we saw Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and the massive riots and sit-ins and in non-violent way, basically, that changed some laws in order to allow or to at least stop the disenfranchisement of African Americans. But that, see, power, white power privilege, power does not concede anything without demand, but it also does not allow any kind of reforms to take place in a way that will satisfy or at least deal with the underlying problems. So in most instances, what we have is a minimal concessions given just to quell social unrest. And that's what would happen. So you bring some of the elites of these minorities and you give them certain privileges so that they can be enough to quell that social unrest that had existed. Now, if we look today, we're talking about over half a century after the much of what was taking place in terms of not just racial inequality, but in terms of bringing some sort of equality to the population, in terms of laws and others. We even had a black president for 8 years. We had two successive attorney generals, black attorney generals, Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch. We had a black Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson. We have all this at one time, and this was just less than a decade ago, and yet much of these so-called reforms have not really taken root into the society. So these reforms, or so-called reforms, have only been at the margin, but deep down in society we still have structural racism that hasn't been dealt with, and the white privilege class doesn't want to deal with it. So what do? They create wedge issues in society to put black against white, so that no one is going to unite and try to address the underlying problems, economic problems that exist today. And let me talk about that a little bit. In America, which is the richest country in the world, we're talking about trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth, where the US basically can print whatever it wants and get away with it. The only country, and I've discussed that in my previous lecture, whatever it wants, it can deal with it by printing money without real impact on its society in terms of inflation or in terms of prices and so on and so forth. And yet, 0.1% of the population of 332 million control approximately 22% of that wealth. 0.1%. The next 0.9% control about 20%. So we're talking about 1% of the country. This is the real privilege. The real people who have the privilege of wealth and power control about 40% of the resources of the actual wealth of the country. The next 9% control about 20%. So 10% of the people in the United States today control approximately 60% of its wealth. Now the next 50% control about, so that actually, I'm sorry, let me take that back. It's 20, and 35%, 75%. The 10% control 75%. The next 50% control about 25%. The bottom 40% actually don't own anything. So you're talking about a nation with 120 million people who owe very little or nothing, mostly in debt. Actually, according to economist Professor Michael Hudson, about 40% of Americans have a balance in the bank of $400 or less. That's abject poverty. In fact, 40 million people are actually poor. 16, mostly women and children. 16 million of them are children who go hungry. And if they don't go to school and get fed 2 meals in the school, they will sleep hungry. So that's a massive inequality that, with policies, of course, that doesn't come just because it happens that way. There are structured policies in place that keep these things happening and taking place. If we look at the population of minorities today, in terms of African Americans and Latinos, you have approximately 13% of the population as African Americans, about 17% of the population as Latinos. That's about 30%. 30% of 330 million, that's over 100 million people. That's over 100 million people. These are majority of the 40% who are in poverty or who own little to nothing come from these communities. So when you see riots and you see anger and you see feeling of injustice, when you see people actually angry, not just because a white officer killed a black person, that's been happening for decades. From Rodney King, when he was beaten up in Los Angeles in 1992, to the different successive killings of blacks, whether in New York or Kansas or other places, or what we saw in Ferguson with Michael Brown, or what we saw in Florida with Trayvon Johnson, or when we saw it recently with George Floyd. All these are instances that keep coming because there is the psyche within society is built, unfortunately, on racism, where they're not looked at as human beings. They simply looked at as a different race, where they're not worthy of living. And that's where you see movements like Black Lives Matters coming into fruition. I feel it's Trayvon Martin. Sorry, not Johnson. Trayvon Martin. Anyway, so let me get back to the economic situation. So we have an economic situation that has just even been exacerbated with the pandemic. 40 million Americans just filed for unemployment. You have a labor force of about 157 million. A lot of people have already even quit looking for work because of the endemic racist structures that exist today, where, you know, Black people have been denied many things that regular folks get because these of structured policies that have been put in place for years in terms of education, healthcare, talk about the situation with job opportunities, the situation with many other things that take place, the situation with the problems that are within these communities, because in housing, for example, where it is very difficult for these poor communities to raise their level of the quality of life to the point where they can live decent lives, they have to always struggle just to survive. The breakup of the families because of certain social issues that have been taking place because of the lack of education, lack of healthcare, lack of housing, and homelessness, poverty, addiction, you name it. All these problems exist within these communities, and this massively wealthy country cannot deal with these issues because of that wealth inequality that is taking place. When I talk about 0.1% of the Americans controlling 22% of the wealth, and talk about 0.9% of the rest of the 1% controlling 20%, we're talking about $75 trillion. These are $75 trillion that people enjoy, where the rest of society have absolutely no access to any of that. 75 trillion with a T. Now, when we talk about, I mean, I can go on and on with economic issues. These are underlying factors that get into these issues of the feeling of injustice, the feeling of inequality, that because of the color of my skin, because of my historical background of coming from certain communities, or because of this endemic poverty, where generation after generation after generation live in poverty across the nation, where you can't find a way out. You end up, you have the percentage of African Americans going to prison, the probability of going to prison is much higher than going, for example, to college. We talk about, you know, of course I experienced this firsthand during my case, when you have 2.2 million people in prison today, the highest incarcerated nation in the history of mankind. 2.2. This is a business. Prison became a business today. Now, over half of these people are Latinos and African Americans, and I saw this firsthand, how these people are denied justice. This is not about criminal justice system taking revenge or taking or getting justice, or even this is about how to keep a community down by policing, by certain structures. The whole law has been structured so that we can keep these communities down, so that they will never raise their heads up and try to challenge this racist situation. Now, I want to also add, when we talk about this, we have to talk about, when we talk about reforms, that is it possible? Is it possible to reform this through the political process? And certainly, when you look at the American democratic experiment, you could see that you have, in theory, the possibility of actually working, and I have this also firsthand experience. We can go and lobby and work so that you can change society for the better. And certainly Martin Luther King, with his legacy, he tried to do that by mobilizing and organizing and sending people with massive civil disobedience and civil unrest and nonviolent action and direct actions and all these things together. But as I said, there's a problem. There's an inherent problem within the American democratic system that it's not actually democratic. What do I mean by that? I mean, it does not reflect the will of the people. Take the 2018 elections, for example. Here you had people actually going to the polls. Usually in midterm elections, that's when you don't have a president on the ballot, you don't have many people going to the polls. But in this instance, we had 8.5 million people voting to Democratic candidates more than to Republican candidates, and yet the Senate is still today in the hands of the Republicans. The Democrats, even though they voted more for Democratic candidates, they lost some seats in the Senate. The whole system has been built so that the power would be retained by minorities, and by minorities I mean numerically, not by minorities meaning racial minorities. That because you could see this archaic system called electoral college, for example, and having 2 senators with a vast amount of power in the hands of the Senate for each state. So you have Wyoming with about 500,000 people having 2 senators, and California with 40 million people also has 2 senators. 2 senators against 2 senators. Guess who's going to be bought easier and who's going to be voting for what? So, and you can go on and on and on. You know, most of these smaller states are easily controlled, these politicians. And then you have a Supreme Court. You know, you have about 2,000 judges across the United States, federal judges, and of course appellate justice, a few hundreds, and then you have the 9 Supremes, where the majority of these people today have been appointed by Republican presidents, and they retain much of that. So structurally, the law is very difficult to get around because you have a system of laws, and most of these people, and of course, who makes laws? It's human beings, and if the human beings are being manipulated by certain power groups, by certain privileged classes, it's very difficult to change legally because the whole system has been structured that way. Take for example the concept of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering means that you go and reconstruct districts so that you can have a majority of it, overwhelming majority of it, of minorities, and then you can win as a Republican by 51%, 52%, where the Democrats or the other party could be winning by 70 or 80%. So in that case, you can actually change the demographics so that it can favor you even though you are in the minority. It's a trick that they use, and the courts basically in many instances have protected these kind of practices. And I can go on and on and on of different ways. Take Citizens United, which is a very famous or infamous Supreme Court decision where money became opened in politics, and you know, where they said money is speech. So those who retain 60%, that's the 10% or 75% rather, of America's resources, these are the top 10%, they can basically swamp any political campaign. They can give whatever money, whatever resources they want to the overwhelming majority of the people who would protect their interests and say this is the same as the person in the street who's trying to convince his fellow citizen to defend his rights. Now, when we talk about that, look at participation rates, where even Jim Crow type laws have been changed with new kind of laws in order to restrict people's ability to vote. You know, the US is the only country that actually votes on a working day. Every other country in the world, when they vote, they would have some kind of a holiday to allow people to actually vote. But here we have the situation where the voting has to take place on a work day, where the overwhelming majority of the people, as I said, are trying just to earn a living, to make ends meet. So we have 139 million people going to the polls in 2016, 63 million vote for Hillary Clinton, 60 million vote for Trump, and Trump is the president. And yet, over 100 million people didn't even bother to vote. 100 million people didn't even bother to vote. This is actually the majority, because they don't see any change in the system. They don't see any possibility of change in the system. They gave up on the system because not only you have this new fascist groups in terms of the Republican Party, you have this new liberal within the Democrats where they don't actually deliver. And I gave you the example of having Obama lynch Holder and Jay Johnson are not even being able to do any kind of meaningful reform for the criminal justice system, where the overwhelming majority of African Americans have been the victims of this system that was created actually during Reagan and Clinton, Republican and a Democrat, back in the 80s and the 90s. So, in terms of the can we effect changes, it's a lot of people are giving up. You know, how are we going to affect changes? Take the elections this year because of this archaic electoral system. The election of the next president, the only reason somebody like Trump, a fascist president, a racist, a bigoted president, the only reason he may have a chance is because of the system. About 42 states have already been determined. They don't even bother to campaign in them. California, the largest state, Trump will never set a foot, and Biden will never set a foot. It's already been decided. New York has been decided. Texas almost been decided, always been decided in favor of the Republicans. You have only a collection of about 7 or 8 states where they can concentrate, where Trump has amassed this massive hundreds of millions of dollars, where he's going to overflow the whole states in deceptions and deceit in order to get elected. And who knows? I mean, he may get successful. Of course, I mean, if by all the polls he should lose. But the only reason he has a chance is because you have 8 states who would actually determine. And when you look at the actual numbers, it's scary, because it is possible that he may actually pull an upset or a win, not because he's going to get a majority. Far from it. Everybody concedes he's not going to get a majority, but simply because he can manipulate a system that has been put in place, and it's extremely impossible, not difficult, impossible to change, you know, through whatever means. Even the Constitution of the United States today cannot be changed through the people, and that's inside. To change the Constitution, if you have a majority of the people, that means they have to elect a majority of people in Congress, and I laid out how difficult that is because of the control of money and politics and the two-party institutions. And then you have to change, you have to get 2/3, but you have the small states who would never allow that, because that will take from their power. When a person in Wyoming has 11 times, he is 11 times, or she 11 times more powerful than someone who's in California, which is just across the state. Southwest. So when we talk about this, then we're talking about an impossible situation that is going to create tension within society. It's very difficult not to see this. You know, in few years, you're going to have the minority, the white race as a minority, which is going to create even more tension. There has been more migration of white males into the Republican Party because of that fear that within them, that somehow they're going to lose this white privilege. And even though when we say about 120 million people don't bother to vote this year, you know, about half of them, or 120 million people who don't even have $400 in the bank, over half of them are white. And yet all what they think about is the right to own a gun, or somehow that their privilege, as if they have privilege, is going to be taken away. And that's how someone like Trump and others are manipulating the situation. Now, when we talk about political issues and how to change this, I'm just laying out the problems that exist. But certainly, Americans have shown that they are capable of rising up, speaking up, because these are things that they have grown with. I mean, you still have certain constitutional protections and constitutional rights that people try to use. We've seen that during the Muslim ban, where hundreds of thousands of people were in the streets defending the Muslim minorities who have been attacked over and over, not just during Trump, but even before Trump, with Bush and Obama and others. We have seen also, you know, the outrage in the midst of a pandemic of people going to the streets by the millions, demanding justice for George Floyd. I mean, these are good signs, but I've also seen it before in the Occupy movement, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring situation, where we saw hundreds of thousands, millions of people going to squares, you know, and demanding structural changes, and it fizzled. And this was even during Obama, who's supposedly a friendly president. Yeah. So the type, the nature of change within the United States, within the empire becomes, when you put all these rules in place, I mean, it's not impossible, but it's extremely difficult because of the nature of how the United States is constructed as a federal state, as states that you cannot really affect the federal situation unless you try to build a movement that will be across state lines. And with the surveillance state, especially after 9/11, becomes even more difficult to do that. And when you see the different social tensions and the social problems and the poverty and the other things, it makes you wonder if you could ever have this kind of a movement that could actually go and structurally change society. So these are some observations I wanted to point out. But also, it's instructive to know that when we talk about people going into the streets, that builds momentum. That builds in the psyche of many people, especially young people, the passion, the need for change. So these are factors that are not to be discounted. Also, when you add to the current situation, you know, unemployment benefits, the United States just passed about $2.5 trillion in 3 bills in the aftermath of the coronavirus. And these were all borrowed money. They don't have money. So all what they have to do is print and hope that no one is going to come and hold them accountable. The House has just passed $3 trillion, which the Senate has basically ignored so far. So you may have another $3 trillion in the pipes. And you can, and all these trillions of dollars that have been spent for the past 20 years, they didn't build a single bridge or airport or any kind of construction or done anything. Over 10 years from the 2008 crisis until this year, that means during Obama and the first 3 years of Trump, they only created 22 million jobs that were lost in 10 weeks and added to that another 18 million. So we have massive problems. So this empire, the question that we're trying to address here, is it unraveling? I don't want to deceive people. I said the US still has massive power at its disposal, many cars to keep it, but it's certainly, because empires, how do empires implode? Well, empires implode because there's an outside power that comes and knocks on its door and replaces it, and that's not to be seen, or because they go bankrupt. And as I argued before, this is not an option now as long as the dollar is the currency of the world. And as long as the US can print dollars and no one holds it accountable, and as long as oil, which is the largest commodity on earth, is sold in dollar, it's very difficult. And as long as also the institutions, the financial institutions in this modern world is controlled by the United States, it's very difficult to see how the United States can go bankrupt, even though it's in debt within public debt and private debt over $60 trillion. But leave that aside. But when we talk about the social cohesion of the society, when that is threatened, that threatens also the American empire. That threatens internally, and usually when that happens, different episodes throughout American history, even though it's only a couple of centuries, 2.5 centuries, the system was always tried to adapt and go forward and allow minimal reforms in order to, in other words, sweep it under the rug and do minimal reforms in order to avoid this situation. Now, with someone like Trump, a fascist president, especially if he's re-elected, and you have this pandemic where you have a lot of uncertainties, where people predict that you may have as much as perhaps 70 to 80%, some economists say, of small businesses could be wiped out, completely not returning. I mean, you're talking about massive changes within society. Would that move people? Is it possible to bring on a movement where that movement can actually sustain itself and go beyond the communities that they're in to become more of a national call for real change and massive change? I don't expect the political class to change much because they do represent today, with few exceptions, the interest of the power structure, the 1%, even though they may have different things to say about other things. But frankly, the Democrats and the Republicans do protect the privileges and the interests of this class. When Bernie Sanders, who actually, according to Europeans, is actually on the right of someone like Angela Merkel and Boris Johnson, when you look at his policies, they are modest, extremely modest when you compare to what's happening, for instance, in Europe. But even somebody like Bernie Sanders, he was not acceptable to this class, even though much of what he had said during his campaign and throughout his political years would have actually avoided what sees today in the coronavirus. Because what you have today, the healthcare system has been transformed through this capitalist system into not a service for humanity, but a service for fee. In other words, they were totally unprepared for this pandemic, because why would a hospital who operates on the principle of profit would stop, whatever needs to be done here? Or why would the pharmaceutical industry look into a possible pandemics in the future if it doesn't bring immediate profit? So it's all about profit, and this is the mentality, this is the paradigm that works within the American political and economic system, and that does not consider, even though you may have many other civic organizations saying otherwise, that does not put into picture the full range of humanity and justice and these issues. I promise not to talk too much, because I want to give the option for discussion, but I want to just conclude with this. America is a country that has dominated the world now for over 50 years. Certainly came in the international stage for over a century now, but has dominated for the past half century. It certainly has many strategic imperatives, which I argued in different forums about this, that will maintain it as certainly a dominant force, if not the biggest or the most powerful force in the world. But with that massive wealth and massive power, military power particularly, but also technological and cultural and so on and so forth, this hegemonic power comes lots and lots of fault lines within society. And if the United States is unable, and it seems like someone who, like Trump, would never be able to deal with these issues, never. So if these issues fester and spread, and the society is unable to deal with them, especially economically, politically, socially, culturally, environmentally, these are 5 issues that, unless they are dealt with within society at all levels, and if the American electorate and the American people are fed up and they are able to overcome their fear of the other, this, as I said, structural psyche of racism that has existed now for centuries. All these are many ifs. But if that happens, then the whole experiment within the American society could actually fail, and usually empires unravel or they lose their power when the central authority loses its ability to control the powers. So if somehow the states, and that's what, it amazes me how someone like Trump is speeding up this process when he tries to say the states have to deal with it. The states, if the states start taking more powerful roles in the lives of the people, and that weakens the central state, then then the American empire would be waning. And as that power wanes, and of course, if added to that would be the challenges that Americans have to face, not just when they engage in wars like they did in Afghanistan, failure, they did in Iraq is a failure, when they did in Vietnam is a failure, when, with every military engagement, with this massive power, it was faced with failures upon failure upon failure. And if people get fed up and they start leaving, and then, yes, the American empire could actually unravel. But where it leads is not necessarily bad, because it could take either course. It could be a force for good, where enough people could rise up and could change the system to make it fairer, more justice and oriented, more equal and more humane, or it could actually disintegrate, which would be a disaster because of the amount of wedge issues that exist today, the amount of weapons in the people's hands, and of course, unfortunately, someone as racist as Trump is trying to take advantage of this. Someone was saying the other day how legally he actually, and this is an interesting and instructive point, I'm going to end on this, how can he actually steal the election legally? Because that's what most people do not know. Most people do not know that the American people do not actually elect the president. What the American people do is that they elect people who are supposedly going to elect a president. This is the meaning of the electoral. You elect, when you go to vote in that booth, you elect a person. And that person is not even necessarily going to be the person, even if he wins, who will go elect. Because at the end, these people who have been elected by the people, they have to go to the state legislators. The state legislators could actually change these people and make them different and choose different people than the people that actually have been elected, and that's legal. And then these people would have to go on December the 6th or something and elect a president. And you know what if no one gets a majority? What happens? What happens is that according to the Constitution, again, it's not the majority minority thing. Every this is the House of Representatives. Every delegation of a state will vote as one vote. So again, Wyoming gets one vote and California gets one vote. And within California, if you have 53 congressmen and 27 are Democrats and 26 are Republicans, okay, so the Democrats will get one vote for California. But if you have 30 states who are controlled by Republicans, then you're going to end up with a Republican president as well. So there is a huge problem that has to be addressed at low levels, politically, economically. For example, many people do not know that teachers, this is the only country on the face of the earth, the richest country and the only country that does not pay its teachers or university professors during summertime. Actually, teachers have to go and find some work that is unrelated to their profession so that they can survive. That's a type of twisted logic, and all these changes have to take place for any meaningful change to take place, and all these would be contributors to the unraveling of American empire. But again, there are many ifs here to say. Let me stop here and open up for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, for that insightful breakdown of the entrenched aspects of American injustice. I'm hearing an echo in my voice. Is that also being experienced by other people? Okay. I wanted to ask now, putting this in context with the kind of analysis that you have given on empire before, in which you have shown that the American empire has the capacities, both in its hard and soft power, to maintain hegemony across the globe. And now, again, in this talk, you said that those features that have given America a privileged position vis-a-vis the world still are there. For instance, America is not threatened from an external enemy on its homeland. Also, economically, the American dollar preserves American hegemony in the international economic system. And then I think you said that the only threat that is on the horizon for an empire that has been constructed in the way the American empire does is an internal unraveling or an internal deconstruction of the social fabric and the democratic experiment that holds the country together. However, at the same time, you have said that the American empire has shown, well, the American political class has shown a stubborn commitment to the status quo. And there seems to be very little motivation or even capability demonstrated by this class to adjust to a new reality, to adjust to what needs to be done in order to preserve the integration. And that happens to be because it means pitting their privilege against what seems to be the interest of the public at large. And therefore, they're not willing to give that up. So does that mean that we can conclude that America is headed towards basically an unraveling at some point? Because it is impossible, from the given data that we have, of any kind of substantial change taking place amongst the American political class.
Very good question, and I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say that it is inevitable, but it's certainly one of the scenarios. Now, there are many factors, as I mentioned, and certainly the possibility of this social tension turning into an actual, not necessarily a civil war. By the way, there's not going to be a coup in the United States. All right, it's not just because we don't have an American embassy in Washington, but because the whole structure within the United States does not allow the military to impose itself. It's just too vast of a country for that to take place. So we're not going to see that, but we certainly could see again the minorities, especially with the military-industrial complex, the multinational corporations controlling political life in the United States, where people feel suffocated, that there isn't enough to satisfy them anymore. They have been, sending them, okay, let's send everybody $1,200. Hopefully that will quell them. Well, it's not going to be enough, $1,200, where the overwhelming majority of the money actually went to Boeing and other privilege. $2.5 trillion. That's a lot of money. How much of it actually went directly to the people? And even this the hope was we give $1,200 to the people so that they can spend it, so that we don't lose companies. But anyway, so the question is going to depend on what about the 120 million people who don't go to vote? Are they going to go to vote? And are they going to get only satisfied with going to the booth every 2 years or 4 years? That's not enough. For the American transformation to take place, which has to be at revolutionary levels, there are deep structural changes that have to take place. And I wouldn't bet on it, because the odds are so much against that type. And I've seen enough, for the past 40 years or so, or 50 years even, that this is actually very difficult.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from our participants. Is Dr. Sami Al-Arian still there? Dr. Sami, are you there? We have a couple of questions from our participants that I would like to bring to light once Dr. Sami comes back. Hello, Dr. Sami, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back. What happened? I don't know what happened. We got disconnected, I guess. Okay.
There are some questions from
yes, go ahead.
Audience of the viewers that I would like to articulate here. One of them is, we have observed, such as the Wall Street Journal has mentioned, that most of the majority of protests have taken place in those states where the Democratic Party is holding power. And therefore, the Democratic Party has an incentive to not end the unrest in order to put pressure on the federal government. Could this be interpreted as an opportunistic political move by the Democrats to manipulate the protest in order to gain electoral advantage?
Let me say this. Every party would like to take advantage, of course, and they try to use whatever situation they're in. But political parties, that's what most people do not understand about the United States. Political parties are very weak in the US. Yes, they have a presence in every state, and they are well financed, and mostly by corporations, but they're pretty weak. Just imagine any country in the world where someone is an outsider who comes and registers one day to become a member of that party. The next day, he announces his candidacy, and in a year and a half, he becomes a president. And then takes the whole party into different direction where it had been. And he beats every other candidate who's been a lifelong Republican. So what does that tell you? It tells you that political life in the US is pretty thin, and that parties are not that powerful. People do not give, and it's very easy. Many people sometimes they switch allegiances. And actually, if you look at the history of political parties in the US, there has been a massive shift and realignment that started with Nixon, but it culminated with Reagan's in the 1980s, where many of the because of, again, the legacy of the Civil War, many of the South was Democratic, because it was the Republican Party with Lincoln who actually signed the Emancipation Proclamation, fought the Civil War, won the northern states against the southern states, and the Republican Party was looked up as being the party of liberation, of freedom, the party of growth, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, after that, with TDR, Theodore Roosevelt, you tried talking about the party of imperialism or imperial power. But that shift took place in the 80s, where now most of the southern states are Republican, where those are fearful of the minorities, fearful of the African Americans, fearful of the Latinos, who represent today 30% of the population combined. And they're fearful that somehow, and of course, that came through years and years of massive brainwashing, that the white power is weakening, and that means privileges is going to be taken away, even though half of the poor people are white people. So I don't bank much on changes within the political establishment, but of course everybody's going to take advantage of what's happening. If we can use whatever is happening on the streets today to our advantage politically, why not? We could do that. Why not? Because we are the only alternative. People, unfortunately, don't have alternatives. It's not like you have a Democrat and a Republican and an alternative. That may happen in the future, by the way, but for that to happen, then that means that a state like Texas has to flip from Republican to Democrat, where Republicans will no longer be able to win presidency. If they lose a big state like Texas, and that could happen if you have enough Latinos in Texas willing to vote, then if they lose Texas, then that's going to have another realignment where the Republicans will no longer be able to win elections. That will split them. So those who like Mitt Romney, who are pro-business and but not necessarily have the same racist mentality like others, or at least they hide it, they will split, and then that will further make the Democrats maybe 10 years later to split again between those who are really progressives and those who are really protecting the interest of the companies. If you have this over, let's say, 20 years, where instead of having two main trends, Republicans, Democrats, then we're going to have four, and then two of them, the pro-business Democrats and the pro-business Republicans will come together, and you end up with three. At that time, the hold of the special interest groups will weaken, and you may have a new political structure. But all that, of course, is speculation, even though we have some evidence that this might actually happen. But that means you have to have massive participation by the people. 120 million people, that's a lot of people not participating. Hillary Clinton, she lost Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania on few thousand votes. These are votes that actually went massively to Obama. People just simply didn't go to vote. If enough people in Detroit who voted for Obama went and voted for Hillary Clinton, she would have won Michigan. Same could be said about Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. So, but this is only changes around the margin, because Democrats, we have seen it during Obama, cannot actually do structural, effectual changes. For that to happen, you need a mass movement, and that mass movement is going to go and shake up the pillars of this empire, and that takes decades, but that takes also commitment, and that takes a lot of sacrifices to take place, but it comes gradually.
Can we visit a kind of a tense point that has been discussed, not just regarding American empire, but generally? What I'm noticing a lot about the commentary around Trump and the now 3 to 4 years of his irresponsible presidency is both certain fundamental questions about democracy. right? The ability for the democratic order to put in power responsible leadership, which is not just proven by Trump, but Modi in India. Also, for instance, in Poland, we have another kind of rising question of, like, Western fascism. Other places around the world, Brazil is another one. There's this growing fear that democracy itself is a problem in creating meritocratic leadership. On the other hand, it seems that democracy is the only cure as well. I mean, the way that you're articulating the situation is that, the only way that this can be solved is through people power, through further demonstrations, a kind of democratic protest movement that has broad coalitions, etc. So I'm seeing that on a structural level, we have a tension within the democratic order that, democracies give us fascism. They have the potential to give us fascism. And yet, we keep going back to democracy as the model to save us. So how do we square this circle? I mean, it seems like a kind of a paradoxical situation.
Wow, that is a really good question. And I think it's a question that philosophers have been trying to answer, or at least deal with, for centuries. How do you see the will of the people projected in a way in which the whole society could benefit and not become a majoritarian situation like what's happening in India, for example, with the Hindutva, with the nationalist Hindu movements, basically trying to dictate to the rest of society. And I think that's one of the major problems. And I think the American founding fathers were trying, when they said we didn't create a democracy, we created a republic. I think they had that in mind. They didn't want to have the dictatorship of the majority, but at the same time have enough participation. I think their heart was in the right place, but of course the experiment that we see today is not working. Black people, they were counted, not voted, but counted as 3/5 of a person. They were not even looked at as being a person who is worthy of voting. But also, by the way, this is the foundation of the U.S. If you were not a landowner at the time, you didn't have the right to vote. So even if you were white, so it's not about racism, it's about class. But of course, that has changed over the years. And now we don't have real participation. So one of the predicaments, or one of the dilemmas, or one of the problems we need to look at and really resolve is what does democracy really mean? I mean, protections, of course, constitutional protections for minorities and so on and so forth, but participatory democracy is not just for you to have the ability, even with many problems, to go to vote. In the US, the participation rate is dismal. I mean, we're talking about in the off year, about 40% of the people who could actually bother to vote. And then, talking about you go and you have a ballot and you don't, and then you're not part of the process anymore, even though you should. So we need to create, or at least have, a new concept of what a democracy means. And then this is not about a two-party system. Most people gave up. Why did they give up? Because they don't see a difference, real difference. My children, as one example, they don't see a real difference between a Democrat and a Republican. I remember back in '89, I was listening to a debate between the Democrats and Bush, the elder Bush, Bush father. And the debate was about the budget, of the military budget. And I got very curious. I mean, it was really heated debate. And I wanted to know, and it was hearing in Congress and then followed up by many speeches. And so I looked at the actual difference. Bush was presenting at the time, if I remember correctly, something like $290 billion of the defense budget. The Democrats budget was 289. This whole fight was about $1 billion out of almost $300 billion. It was no fight at all. It was just jockeying positions. The real fight would have been, should we spend 100 billion or 300 billion? That would have been a real fight. But the difference was 1 billion. That wasn't a real fight. So most Americans, when they go to the polls, they see Democrats, Republicans, to them, the difference is very minimal, even though on something like appointment of judges, and it does affect them, especially on Supreme Court appointments. But when you have real democracy, then it's not about two people, and one of them may not even, like, you know, when Bill Clinton was elected, he didn't have a majority of the people. When George W. Bush was elected, he didn't have the majority of the people. None of the people who voted, with maybe exception of Obama, never reached 50%. So what you say is that one of the ways to have real democracy is to have candidates. Then I can vote, not feeling that my vote is wasted. I can go to a third vote. And if it doesn't win, then you have multiple votes, and that's done automatically. There's been a lot of studies on this, you know, where you can have, you know, people basically, and the same thing with Congress. You know, always I want to give Green Party, or I want to give someone, but I'm afraid, you know, I'm gonna be wasting my vote voting for that person. But if you have this system, if no one reaches the 50%, then the last one is eliminated, and that vote is not wasted anymore. That goes to another candidate, which you can actually get the best candidate to win eventually. Something like that. We need structural reforms. This whole thing about electoral college needs to go away. But that means constitutional change. And that's not going to happen because the power elites, the ones who actually control power and wealth and money in the United States, they will not allow that, because that takes from them. So that you need a real mobilization by the people to have a real revolution to affect change. That means participation. That could happen, but it's going to take a long time for that to happen.
Can I take this in a different direction? I mean, when in the 1960s, African-American political leaders were contemplating their position vis-a-vis the American empire, there were some in the Black International, including Malcolm X and others, who had recognized that the relationship between African Americans and the white establishment is not just an American problem, but it goes into the heart of the American imperial control over the world at large. I mean, they did this by a number of ways of connecting the colonial order. For instance, the way economic elites around the world are recruited to be compradors for a global, or you could say Atlantic, capitalist class, and many other ways in which race plays into the way the colonial structures were implemented legally and institutionally. Could you say a few words about how significant, for instance, the current crisis around the safety and security of African American lives in 2020 plays into a larger question of American legitimacy abroad? I mean, I have issues, for instance, about the ability for America to criticize China in Hong Kong, or the ability for America to criticize Russia against Putin. I mean, the democratic movements against Putin, and many others. There seems to be certain relationships that we need more clarity on. So could you comment, first of all, about the structural ways in which this issue of African American rights and participation plays into the grander schemes of American empire abroad?
Excellent points you're bringing up. You know, Frantz Fanon addressed that. Martin Luther King certainly did, and of course Malcolm X, as you mentioned. These two things, what happens outside and inside, are very much related, and they cannot be disassociated. I remember some of the slogans during the 60s, when MLK was leading these demonstrations. They would talk about the war in Vietnam, and they would talk about race problems and relations in the United States, and they were hand in hand. Those who were defending the wars in Vietnam were the same ones who are defending the status quo at the time, and those who were against the war were basically to change the status quo against racist policies within the United States. And I think it's the same today. When we talk about democracy, there is a lack of democracy, or at least absence of real democracy across the globe. I'm not talking about just places where you have dictators and tyrannical rulers like in the Middle East and others. I'm talking about the whole world at large. I mean, today in India, for example, you have a racist, nativist, xenophobic person who is in charge and is implementing racist policies because and the world is watching. No one's holding him accountable because of the nature of, again, nation state and the international order. We had for many years before the war turned ugly that was taking place in Serbia and Bosnia. We saw that also we see it every day in Palestine, in a settler colonialist structure. The fact that you see a white police officer putting his knee on the neck of a black person who is handcuffed and face down for 9 minutes until he dies, pleading for his life, saying, "I can't breathe." This same picture was happening in Palestine for many years. And you have an Israeli soldier putting his knee on a Palestinian youth who's pleading for his life to breathe, and the world didn't really bother much. I mean, so we need a worldwide solidarity movement where they can identify the different struggles as one struggle, and the enemies as one, which is, racist mentalities, the mentality of supremacy, that my race is superior to yours, whether it's white, whether it's Zionist, whether it is Hindu, whatever it is. These kind of ideas, these kind of dangerous attitudes are the ones who are the common enemy of all. They try to put us or pit us against each other, but it's all one struggle. I remember in the 1990s, late 80s, early 90s, in the struggle against apartheid, America was the last country to turn against apartheid. Reagan, the president at the time, he defended the South African apartheid racist government until the very end, until it was overwhelming that he couldn't resist anymore. And he was still calling the ANC and Mandela as terrorists and leftists and communists and what have you. But there was a worldwide movement that carried this struggle all the way to the White House, and they had to change and adapt. And we're talking about the same struggles, basically, that the U.S. has, of course, much influence around the world, and therefore they are affecting many of these governments, and the lack or the giving support or lack of support do affect these policies, whether in Palestine or India or in any place around the world. So what I would say is that the same way the U.S. has been giving Arab autocrats this level of support, where they can kill and maim and imprison and detain whoever they want. They can kill even embassies and get away with it, or they can put 60,000 people in prison and get away with it. It's giving them cover. That the whole world has to come also in solidarity against these racist concepts and these imperialist trends, in order to stand up together to change the situation. And that's going to take a lot of efforts and a lot of but that's the nature of life. I mean, life is a struggle, and if you do not fight for something you believe in, something ideal, something lofty, something your aspirations, what's the meaning of life? Then life has no meaning.
Thank you for that. So that's a very interesting suggestion that you put forward about having a global solidarity movement in which violations of human rights and the dignity of people, especially in terms of these fascist policies that are taking root, are pushed back by a global solidarity movement. But my question is, no doubt that a strong China and a strong Russia, right, I mean, certain countries would create a situation in which the American imperial project would have to deal with contenders to its supremacy. So can we interpret, for instance, those who are rising up to destabilize? I'm not talking about legitimate civil rights movements, but the kind of destabilization that takes place in these countries, as also part and parcel with those who are now struggling in the streets of Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, we should also mention that we had a situation in America where 21 states, the National Guard was called into the streets. We had protests on the scale of 120 to 125 cities, right? Which is unprecedented, at least in my lifetime. So, you know, can these come under a single fold? I mean, I know the Indian case seems to be one that is convenient to think about, but let's take China, for instance. If China becomes stronger and continues on the path that it does, there's no doubt that very well-established policy thinkers in the U.S. consider that to be an existential threat to American power, at least in Asia. So, could we also interpret that what's happening in Hong Kong is equivalent to what's happening in the streets of Atlanta, or can this be a solid? How do we make it? How do we distinguish? Because some people would like to make that all the same. I mean, these are all the same, but how do we distinguish the nuances between these?
That's a lot of questions. Let me unpack them and try to answer them the best I can. First of all, nation states are different from people's movements.
Yes.
And they're not necessarily the same. So when we talk about China and Russia, they represent interest of a state and state institutions. Let's take Russia, for example. Could Russia be a contender or a rival to the United States? And the answer, in my view, is very simple. No, it can't, because it lacks the basic factors, the basic elements needed for it to be a contender. Or what Russia certainly is a power, but it's a medium-sized power because of its location, because of its the possession of nuclear weapons, because of its weapons industry, and that's pretty much it. Of course, because of its leverage over natural gas, you know, its importation to Europe. But it does not have the resources needed for it to be a contender. It does not control any institutions worldwide. Doesn't even have much military bases, maybe one or two around the world. One of them is in Syria, which is recent. And it does not have, what Russia is doing basically is trying to survive as any other state by accumulating certain powers to fend itself against any possible aggression. You know, NATO, which has existed now for about over 60 years, close to 70 years. We're talking about a military alliance where its declared enemy is Russia. And so all what Russia is trying to do is to defend itself, and to do that they need to push as west as possible, so that any attempt or misjudgment from the West would not take place at their soil. And that's what's happening in Ukraine and others. So it's trying to fend that off by trying to accumulate other cards in its geopolitical struggle with the United States. But it is not a real contender. Look at the economy of Russia versus the economy of the United States. It's not even 10%. Now, China is a different story altogether, because China has risen in the past 20 years, where now it's about 2/3 of its economy equal to the United States, and the prediction is that at one point it will even surpass that. So that's a real threat to U.S. hegemony. Yet it's not. It hasn't reached any level of an immediate threat. It's a potential threat. So what the U.S. is trying to do now is to keep China in its own region, not being hegemonic, because according to Mearsheimer and others, is that for you to become a global hegemon, you have to be at least regional one. So the U.S. is preventing that, and it's doing its utmost to make sure that China will never be a regional hegemon, not in the South China Sea, not in the East China Sea, not in anywhere. So they are building alliances, which they have done for years. Japan, South Korea, now Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. So all these is going to hopefully, from the American perspective, not allow or delay as much as possible the possibility of China being a regional hegemon. Another indication would be if the naval power of China, if China starts building a real big naval power, that would be obviously an indication of their intention to challenge U.S. hegemony around the world. But if they only are content with naval power just for the region, obviously that's a different thing. What the United States is doing today, and maybe we need to do a whole thing about the relationship, is simply to force China to negotiate the power relationship with America while it's in a weak position. What China is trying to do is to avoid that moment where it does not negotiate, but it still accumulates power over the next 20, 30 years, then it can negotiate in a better terms with the US. The US is trying to force China to know, let's negotiate now. This is how much power I'm going to allow to give you, and you have to be content with that. And this is how much we've got, in terms of currency, in terms of trade deficits, in terms of the different arrangements of power structures. And what China is trying to say, I'm not interested in ruling the world. I don't need to negotiate. I'm not interested in anything. I'm just trying to live. And the US said, no, we don't think that's what you're doing. You're trying to wear us out so that you can have a better way to negotiate and then take from our power. This is the nature of the conflict. I don't think it's going to lead to war, but it's going to lead to a lot of friction and possibly even proxy wars.
Dr. Sami, I have to jump in, and there's a couple of questions that came in on the while you were speaking, and I'm going to group them together and let you close with addressing them. First question is, do the ongoing protests affect do they affect anything in the Middle East? For instance, we've seen policies in the Middle East such as the policies with in terms of Palestine, but we've also seen American policies roll back in terms of Iran, and the JCPOA. So do we in the short term or long term, do we see any effect on American foreign policy with the Middle East? Especially with Iran in mind and in Israel.
Is there another question, or that's it?
Yes, no, there's another question.
Let me address this one, and then we'll get to the last one. Everything is related to everything. There is nothing in politics that is isolated. So when the US government, the US administration, is busy trying to quell it, or at least put out the fire that is internal, that means everything outside is going to take a back seat. So of course it's going to be related, but in which direction? Will Trump, for instance, change his policy against Iran? The answer is no. Would Trump change his policy in the Middle East vis-a-vis the Palestinian situation? The answer is no. He's not going to change. In fact, he will allow the Israelis to do whatever they want, because he's not concerned, or he doesn't have the time needed to put any pressure or to change it. He will just wash his hand. Of course, if you have a Democratic administration, the situation may be different. Now, does that mean that people who are outside, they have also an advantage, a way to break out of the American grip, or under the American grip, or change certain policies? Of course, that gives you a maneuver, whether it's Iran or the Palestinians or others. But of course, that depends on the balance of power that is at place right now. We have a massive imbalance of power between the Palestinians and the Israelis, which means we have to think of the conflict in a different way. There has to be another paradigm, a paradigm shift in about how we are going to, as people who are also fighting against racist ideology and fighting against the imposition of a settler colonialist state. It's the same mentality. So we have to think on those terms, and that builds solidarity with Black Lives Matter and with the solidarity movement within changing the structure of a racist society. So the short answer is, the United States would maintain its policy, but it's not going to concentrate. It's not going to have to start a war. Everything can happen. It's a crazy guy, but he's not going to start a war in Iran when you have a massive dislocation, a massive shake-up within your own society. You're trying to bring it back together, and that's going to take a while. And this is an election year, so anything that he does is going to affect the chances for his re-election. I think he just diminished his chances widely with his response to the pandemic, as well as to the George Floyd murder. So, but with Biden, we're different. Of course, every president puts a different way of putting things, but we haven't seen yet any real candidate, whether from the Democrats or otherwise, where they are willing to talk about the real structural changes I have talked about in this presentation, including somebody like Obama, as I said. He didn't even do that. Yeah, last question.
Dr. Sami, I would also like you to, you've spoken a lot about the coming elections and how they'll be difficult for them to win, so I'm going to ignore that question that was posed about your comments about that. Dr. Amr Darrag has asked, there are also other social factors that could contribute to the collapse of the society, like the reduction of the role of the quote-unquote normal family. More than 50% of families now are not quote-unquote normal, man and wife. You also have terrorism by white supremacists, etc. So there's a lot of other issues I think that he's trying to point to that could cause structural social upheaval in the United States. Do you agree, or is there anything you would like to comment?
Right, certainly. I mean, Chris Hedges has written a whole book, and actually maybe even several books, talking about how the disintegration of the American family and the lack of faith within the institutions, that the faith institutions, how that has deteriorated in the United States, how that's going to be a huge contributing factor to the disintegration of society and therefore to the disintegration of the whole American experiment. He has talked about that for years and has written about it, not only in his columns, but also in his books. Will this be a direct impact? I'm not sure, but because the United States, with the modern family, it's been going in certain directions, but certainly it could be a contributing factor that I wouldn't discount it. And of course, there is also a backlash against this within society itself. So it is possible, not impossible, it's possible that within the realm of things that there could be self-correction about how to deal with the disintegration of families, how to deal with the different social trends that are taking place, in which there could be self-correction, but I can't count on it. I cannot say for sure it's going to happen, but that is not just something that every American agrees with. There are a lot of pushback within society to deal with these issues, that these are not normal issues, these are not healthy issues, that this will lead to the end of society, of civilization in the American context. So, but even if we deal with these issues, let's call them social moral issues, they are still not by themselves. Even if all of them do not take place, you still have enough structural problems that is going to affect the end of American empire. So, in other words, these are not necessary conditions; they are added conditions to the whole experiment. And I agree. I totally agree that the trends have accelerated in the past 30 years, and a lot of people may not see the danger, but it certainly is a contributing factor. And there are much research that has been done on this, and they confirm that.
I want to. There's one last question, and we've got a little bit of time, so I want to give you that question. It says, in his classic book, Democracy in America, Alex de Tocqueville predicted the erosion of the U.S. from within, inside. But what happened over the course of history was the opposite. The U.S. rose as the greatest power in the history of humanity because of the U.S. system was able to permanently to reform and rectify its mistakes. My question, what could prevent the U.S. elites to continue the same path of rectification of the system and social problems now, and, as we have seen from the Trump administration, keep America great again?
Well, certainly somebody in the neoliberal factions, that's what they're arguing, that we have the ability to self-correct, that we've done it in the past. They point out to the different experiments, whether with Franklin Delano Roosevelt or FDR, or certainly during the 60s with Kennedy and Johnson, and so on and so forth. I'd say that it's possible. Let me just say plainly that it's possible that might happen. And that's been the American experience. Actually, is that they try to take a problem, try to divide it up, and try to deal with it, and see how much concessions they are willing to give, that it's not going to take much from the privileges, and that it will be enough to satisfy those who are disenfranchised. That's a possible discourse. But yeah, I wouldn't bank on it. I think we are in a different era. But also there are other factors that in the past America did have the resources to deal with these issues. Now America doesn't have the resources. It's living a lie, and that lie is, as long as we are the #1 in the world, we can simply print money and solve the problems. We can get ourselves out of it, and no one can hold us accountable. If that changes, then America cannot dig itself out by printing money or by bribing communities or changing it. There has to be deep structural changes. What does that mean? It means wealth transformation. Wealth transformation is going to be a class warfare. If you have $75 trillion in the hands of 10% of the people, to get a chunk of this, it's going to be a war. These people will not just give up their wealth because somebody demanded it. So if we get to that situation, if they're willing to print $5 trillion to solve the problem, they will print $5 trillion to solve the problem. But if these $5 trillion do not solve the problem, then we're back to where we are today. So what are we going to do about this? It has to be resolved somehow, because this integration of society, that means everybody is affected. So the white privileged class, the military-industrial complex, the multi-level corporations, all these multinational corporations, all these are not going to give up easily. So there would have to be a real fight, and the fight is always between entrenched powers. The people who have nothing, their only power is their numbers and their ability to stand up together. I wouldn't bank on that. Most experiments, that's why revolutions are very rare in history, because people usually do not do that except at certain circumstances when all these factors come together. So for the American people to all rise up, you have to have a common, you have to have a leadership that is willing to take you all the way down. You have to have a common purpose. What is that purpose? Not just to get justice for George Floyd. There has to be much bigger than that. And the problems have been so much deep into the system, is that one fix is not going to fix it. So to do that, you need a different paradigm. You need really to think about a real movement that's going to go and talk about the economic inequality and restructuring, the political disenfranchisement and restructuring, the social problems and restructuring, and even the legal ones. I don't have the answer, but I know that it has to be a mass movement that is willing to shut the country down like the pandemic did, in order to change it and force real changes. And that's going to.
I want to intervene for a second, because we're running out of time, and I have one last issue I wanted to say over the course of our discussion, and then I want to give the floor to you to end the session at 5:30. What I want to say is that, I want to talk about tactics a little bit, right? So of actually trying to accomplish change on the ground. You've mentioned now a number of different things, but I still see a drastic tension. I mean, from someone who has witnessed the Arab Spring and who has seen a number of democratic uprisings across the globe, what we have seen is that actually governments have a very calculated method of infiltrating people power, right? So we've seen in Egypt, for instance, the security apparatus aiding and abetting protesters, creating cause for increasing security and policing. We've seen in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, for instance, instigating and provoking protesters to raise the question to violence so that the state can then respond. And likewise, in these protests, we've seen many people who protesters claim are not part of the movement, who are not peacefully protesting, who are creating arson and looting and all kinds of anarchist tendencies which are delegitimizing. So my question goes back. I mean, people power has the ability to put fascists in power. People power is also, from my perspective, has already shown that it's completely infiltrated by intelligence and surveillance and all kinds of very intricate tools of governmentality. So that leaves me in a very skeptical position vis-a-vis a hoped pushback. I mean, we see that, people power is not enough. I mean, maybe there's other tactics that we have to consider. For instance, some people have articulated targeting the money of these insurance companies who back police, etc. Some others, some old experiments of trying to break the mold was Malcolm X's desire to bring it to not a civil rights issue, but a human rights issue. I mean, is there any way that we can get beyond this kind of entrenched, I would say, ways of making people power impotent because of the infiltration of the government within the very forces that we seek to have hope in?
No doubt. I mean, you mentioned, and I don't think I addressed in my talk today tactics. I think what I was trying to do is to talk about the end goal. What are we trying to accomplish? Because this is what's missing. No justice, no peace. These are the slogans that have been said on the streets throughout the United States. I can't breathe. These are all good. But what is the goal? What are we trying to accomplish? And I'm trying to say here is not just justice so that we can put 4 white police officers in prison. The problem is much more deeply entrenched in society. And unless there is a mass movement, I didn't talk about democracy. I said there's a lot of problems with democracy in the United States. But unless you have a mass social movement that is willing to stand up for all these inequalities and for all these problems that exist today, it's going to be very difficult to see how we can have real reforms at the stage of the United States. Therefore, if we don't get these reforms, if we don't get massive people, and because you're not only going to change the political system, because obviously that's even more difficult, but you have to change the economic infrastructure or the economic system. You have to change a lot of the way people think, the culture, and the United States and the American people have the ability to do that because they are free people. They can actually do it, but there are so many pressures. Or this is unlike people in much of the Middle East, where even if people don't want it, there's structural things that will allow them not to do that. There, people, if they actually have the will, they can have the way. Now, I didn't address tactics. We can certainly sit down and talk about all kinds of tactics, and I agree with you with everything you said. I have no problem, choosing whatever tactics. But in terms of democracy, in terms of getting people involved, there's no way around it. We have to get the people. The people are the only one who are going to force change. The only reason Trump cannot control the US because of people in the streets. He can say whatever he wants, but you have hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the streets he can't control. And therefore, the system could actually break down. And if the system breaks down, that's going to threaten the elites, and they will give concessions. The amount of concessions they will give is going to depend on how much power are in the streets and people are demanding. The more you demand, the more you're going to get. The more you demand, the more you're going to get. So as you build this movement and your demands go from economic to political to social to cultural to everything, then it's going to have a massive change. That takes time. That takes decades to happen, but it's not impossible. But at the same time, they will try to use all their tools, including surveillance state and law enforcement and others, in order to diffuse this situation, because they have every incentive to make sure that doesn't succeed. And they've done it. It's not like hasn't been done. They did it in the 60s and against the civil rights movement. They did it in the 90s until now, against the Muslim minorities in order to even though they're pretty weak, they did it against many civil rights organizations, civic organizations. Anybody who is a dissident basically has become a target in one way or another.
Thank you very much.
But I want to end in a positive note. I just want to say that the American people do respond. It's just if they would have the wise leadership and the correct framework, because I was there and I can tell you that a lot of meaningful, good meaning people are out there. And I think if we can build, or if they can build the coalition needed to lift the country up, and by standing up to these injustices, it is possible it could be done. And it has, and the struggle for many causes in the life of the United States is plenty for us to show around and to point to. And I think I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful with young people, actually. I'm very, very hopeful. I have seen them in the streets, with the line up on the streets. Yesterday, young females were taking rubber bullets like they were in the streets of Ramallah or Nablus, and they were taking tear gas, and they were saying, we're going to continue. This is unacceptable. And if that happens, and it brings all these massive people into the streets demanding real structural changes, and I think the power elites would have to concede more, and who knows. real change may take place.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami. That runs us out of time. I really appreciate your insights and comments. This is a very important question. It's on the minds of everybody. And I want to appreciate your time. This has been a webinar series at SIGA, and please stay tuned for further series of series and book reviews that we do here. Again, thank you very much for all those who participated. Bye-bye.